So I've called this the UPF Touch. I'm not claiming to talk about everything we do at all. I'd like to see what works and why. What you've already heard, you had an introduction looking at UPF in action and universal principles, and then been through some of the key principles. So I want to connect certain principles to some of the actions of UPF. Give and take action, that is the relationship between one person and another, one organization and another, applied to dialogue and partnership, sacrifice and service as applied to reconciliation, and the heart of a parent, which is very much the root of all that we do. And this is a quotation from our founder, Reverend Sun Myung Moon. Go forward with the heart of a parent, in the shoes of a servant, shedding sweat for the earth, tears for man, and blood for heaven. So it's a nice motto, and I'm going to start with this. Looking back first a little bit at the wider context, what I'd like to do is pick up some activities or programs and show how they work. And I'm dealing with new glasses, so I'm trying not to look over them to you. So if you look on the left, I've got some building blocks, because you know the Universal Peace Federation. Many of you probably know it was a rebranding of the Interreligious and International Federation for World Peace, which was founded in 1999. But that was a combination of two organizations, the Federation for World Peace and the Interreligious Federation for World Peace, which were both established in 1991. But all of that exists on a foundation of decades of work, which all became incorporated into what is now UPF. And when we look at the different associations that we now have in UPF, you can trace most of them back to the work that we were doing 30, 40, 50 years ago, and it's still there. So now we have the International Summit Council for Peace. In the 1980s, already we had the Summit Council for World Peace. Now we have the IAPD, but in the 1980s we had the International Religious Foundation. Yeah. Now we have the IAAP for academics. In the 80s, or even the 70s, we have the Professors World Peace Academy and the ICUS. And I think I'm right in saying that one of the key original staff of the Professors World Peace Academy in Korea is sitting at the back of the room, Mrs. Hannah. So that was the Professors World Peace Academy and the Conference on the Unity of the Sciences. Now we have IMAP, the Media Association for Peace. But we had the World Media Association in the 1980s. And now we have IAACP, the International Cultural Foundation, existed. Just to give you a little bit of perspective that these didn't just pop up. I want to look at a little bit of the development, first tracing some of the interreligious development, because it does deal with the very concept of dialogue almost from the root, and I'd like to look at that. So the Unification Theological Seminary was established in 1975, and it had a multi-faith faculty. As I'm reading here, the faculty was assembled in the school's first 3 years, including members of the Dutch Reformed Church, the Church of Christ, Methodism, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, Judaism and Confucianism, and other faiths came on board as time went by. At that time, UTS hosted a lot of speakers and lecturers from also many more faiths. And they had a lot of weekend dialogues. If you look at that picture, that small one on the black and white one on the right at the bottom. These scholars met together with the students at Unification Seminary and had very interesting theological and confessional dialogue, which was very moving for all those involved. And this was like a basic application of the principle of give and take in people, I'll come back to this, with integrity relating with each other. Because in a lot of relationships, there is manipulation, and it's not real dialogue. We'll come back to that. But this was genuine dialogue, and that meant that things were born from it, which were better for both the partners in the dialogue. One of the things born from it was the new Ecumenical Research Association, which was for dialogue within the Christian world between the different Christian denominations. They had a lot of theologians' conferences, and here is one of them, Richard Kebedo, who I'll speak about later. And they had a lot of research and development and dialogue. Then a series of programs in the 1980s developed under the International Religious Foundation. Here you can see the Council for the World's Religions, and I'm going to read through these titles because you can see there was quite a lot of interesting dialogue going on 40 years ago. The Trinitarian Basis of Christian Unity in Moscow, Intra-Jewish Dialogue in Switzerland, Dialogue for Muslim-Christian Friendship and Understanding in Istanbul, an intra-Hindu conference in Varanasi, India, a Buddhist dialogue in Thailand, and a Cairo conference which was called Summoning Islamic Leaders from the Islamic World at the time of the First Gulf War. These associations formed part of the International Religious Foundation, and it had a number of different other programs going on at the same time. One of these was a series of conferences on God, the contemporary discussion, bringing some of the most prominent theologians at the time together. And here's a comment from one of them. There was an air of excitement and challenge to the status quo there, as hundreds of scholars from around the world and from every tradition gathered on a regular basis to do what philosophy and theology had declared no longer possible, namely, talk about God. Then if you look on the right, Dr. David Hanna spoke earlier about the world scripture. And this is the original. There are two editions. This is the first edition, which came out, I believe, in 1991, a comparative anthology. And look at the words from the English professor from Lancaster University, Ninian Smart, who wrote the foreword. And he, if any of you have ever seen it, he was responsible for the BBC's Long Search series many years ago. And he wrote, this book is compiled in the spirit of reverence for all spiritual paths. I think this is part of, I talked about UPF's touch. How much are we really thinking of the other? How much are we really respecting? You spoke about respect being very important. How much is respect really there underneath? Or how much are we just doing something to promote ourselves or to develop this or that? It's like the key underlying motivation is very important. And this was perceived in this case by Dr. Ninian Smart. The Assembly for the World's Religions gathered on several occasions, and this is the 1991 in San Francisco. We also developed youth programs. Now we have others, but in the early 1980s, the Youth Seminar on the World's Religions brought together for an annual pilgrimage of youth, young people, many of them sons or daughters of religious leaders, people who were interested in their own right, to visit the holy sites of the world. By traveling together and experiencing the many faces of the sacred and the eternal, these young people forged lifelong bonds of love and affection across lines once marred by historical hatred. So here's a development of youth. And when they gathered, when the religious leaders gathered for the Assembly of the World's Religions in 1985, the suggestion came, let's upgrade it. Let's do more than just visit religious sites. Let's do a service program. And from that was born the Religious Youth Service Project, which started in 1986. This picture here is from 1991 in Hungary. And I was actually the director of that project. And from the RYS, I think some of you in this room have probably been involved in RYS projects that have been conducted here in the UK. I think the main lesson I took away from RYS, from my early experiences there, was God is in the other person. And if I don't see it, it's my fault. It really helped me, and that, of course, is the meaning implied under the greeting Namaste. It's the same thing. So now I come to what is dialogue and why we do it. This is, on the left, I want to look at a question that a rabbi had asked to Dr. Frank Kaufman, who was directing the Council for the World's Religions and also the Interreligious Federation. Why does Reverend Moon do the dialogue? And the answer, he believes that give and take action, look at the little diagram on the right to bring you back to the principles that we were studying during the day. He believes that give and take action is the foundation for unity. Thus, dialogue characterizes his peacemaking efforts. He believes that the great living religious traditions reflect God's historical efforts to establish peace on earth. Therefore, he supports activities designed to bring strength and unity to all the world's traditions, and he inspires them to maintain loving and cooperative relations with one another. So that's the thinking behind the interfaith dialogue as perceived at that time. On the right, you see the picture of Paulos Mar Gregorios, the bishop of the Syrian Orthodox Church in India and former president, well, when he was alive, he passed on, of the World Council of Churches. And he spoke about, when he was in Rome one time when I was there, he spoke to us about his early experience in interfaith as a young priest. And he went into this meeting and somebody came up to him and he said, "The problem we feel in interfaith dialogue with you Christians is that we feel that you are like a spider waiting to catch a fly." And that's how he said it to me, because he was talking to me. He said, "Waiting to catch a fly." So he understood that people's suspicion of the early types of interfaith was that you're really coming here with a secret hidden agenda. And you're saying you're interfaith, but you're not really. Now, the world has gone a long way since then, so many people are well aware of the need to go beyond that. But it is fundamental, and it is fundamental to dialogue. Because during that time I was in Rome, part of my responsibility was to try, at that stage, to dialogue with the Vatican. And they're very happy now, but at that stage they were not so interested. But I realized that one of the problems is people's perception of what you want to do in dialogue. People assume that, I know what I want. But actually, if in this little diagram here, you've got a red subject and a blue object, if both of them say, the purpose of this meeting is for what I need, you're not going to get anywhere. You have to find a common purpose that you agree about. That's the only way dialogue is really going to work. When you say, okay, you have your identity, I have my identity. What is it that we want to learn about and share about and communicate about in a way that is genuinely open-minded to the other? And if that genuine open-mindedness is there, then what happens? You build trust. If you respect it. But if you don't respect it, and at the end you just take it off and you use the dialogue you had for your own purpose, then you destroy trust. So it's very much to do with how do we go in? What's the mentality we go in with? Oh, one more thing. Dialogos. What does it mean? Dialogos.
two tongues talk.
Yeah, people usually think dia is die, two. But Ma Gregorios, who's Greek, well, the Greek Orthodox, he's Indian, but he told me, no, it's not, it's dia, not die. Dia means through. So dialogue means talking through until you get a solution. You talk and talk and talk and talk it through. You go through it till you get a solution. So it's a very different concept to two people banging heads, which is what some people think it is. You know, we talk about being beyond borders. I thought I'd give you a slightly challenging statement from our founder. This is from the inaugural speech when UPF was launched in 2005. And here's what he said. I will take the lead in establishing true families, true societies, true nations, and the true kingdom of the peaceful, ideal world. Will you join me as I rise and gain strength in accordance with heavenly fortune? Or will you remain captive behind the same old walls, all of them Satan's handiwork, the wall of your religion, the wall of your culture, the wall of your nationality, and the wall of your race, and spend the remainder of your time on earth in agony and regret? Heaven is challenging, isn't it? Heaven is summoning you to be the wise leaders who will set aright this world of evil and establish a new heaven and a new earth, a new culture, and an ideal kingdom. So he didn't mince his words. He wanted us to be very clear. Let's make it a different world where we go beyond our barriers. So, and he'd already done this 4 years before that speech. I don't know how many of you know of this conference. Everybody knows of 9/11. And 1 month later, we had a conference as the IIFWP in New York. We were the first international conference in New York. And at that conference, the president of Indonesia, Abdurrahman Wahid, came. And in a conference, in a private meeting, Father Moon said to him, I want to do something to help Islam so that the world understands what Islam really is. Can we do a conference in your city? The only thing I asked you to do is tell nobody that I'm doing it for you. Of course, now we can say it, but at the time, he wanted just to quietly support. And some of you probably know Tajuddin Hamad, the vice president of UPF. He was very instrumental in putting it together. And this is I've quoted here the words from the conference invitation. An historic opportunity has been placed at the feet of all Muslim believers. By the grace of Allah, Muslims and people of all faiths are seeking to know the real truth about Islam, the way of peace. We seek to bring a voice of unity, harmony, and compassion to greet current crises and opportunities. This is from the conference invitation. As you see, we published a book afterwards. The conference was only for Muslims, and as you know very well, Reverend Moon is not a Muslim, but he wanted to serve, and this is very much part of the spirit of his whole life. Here are some other examples of the UPF in practice. Again, trying to go beyond borders, break down limitations. On the left, UPF Nepal has held 6 South Asia Peace Initiative conferences that have brought together monarchists, Maoists, and members of the 7-party alliance to dialogue on issues and modalities of Nepal's ongoing peace process. Elections are scheduled for April the 10th. So actually, UPF was very instrumental in bringing together the parties that were not talking at all. The cooperation and assistance of organizations such as the Universal Peace Federation and the ex-MPs Club will no doubt support us in attaining lasting peace. UPF's founder, Father Moon, has developed a universal philosophy that has the power and depth to unite people from all walks of life. I believe that this international leadership conference will help us promote lasting peace and good governance. And that's the Honorable Sahana Pradhan, the Minister for Foreign Affairs. This one you might wonder why it's here, given what's happening now. Many years back, Father and Mother Moon both said you have to really work hard to bridge the gap with Russia. So actually, especially our Austrian UPF took that very seriously and tried to host a number of conferences involving what were already differences. So here, Dialogue for Peace in Moldova in 2014, and then Russia and countries in the Asia-Pacific region toward peace and security and sustainable development in Moscow. We have done a lot of work there, and those bridges still need to be built, whatever's happening today. This was a conference that we held in Syria, again, bringing together the sides that don't normally meet or speak to each other. The person in the top left is a member of the Syrian parliament. The person below him had 30 of his relatives killed by the Syrian regime. But they sat at a table and treated each other as brothers from the same country. One of the most fruitful conferences I have attended in my life. I felt the common Syrian spirit from all sides. You could feel there is the will not only to be Syrian, but to build a new Syria. Sometimes when people ask what I do, I say I work for the Universal Peace Federation, and then I say, I lived 14 years in Syria, so you can see how successful I am. There's a little bit of pain underneath those words, but actually, we need to work. Actually, where the most difficulty is, we need to keep working. But this was a very rewarding conference because people who strongly disagreed treated each other really civilly, and it was very constructive for future building. This is an event that happened in Lebanon in 2006, very shortly after a war with Israel, in which there had been a lot of bombing and fighting in Lebanon. And we invited to Lebanon, from the United States, a group of peace ambassadors who were Muslim and Christian. And we put them into about 10 different groups, and each group had one Muslim and Christian American and one Muslim and Christian Lebanese. And they went to visit places all over, as you can see. They visited 36 places between them in 3 days: schools, churches, mosques, orphanages, city halls, the parliament, monasteries, and universities. And the real success, they said, was when we visited the families and they could feel the heart. But these are the words of that I took from a Muslim newsletter in the United States from one of the American Muslims who attended. He wrote about his visit. The strong message of UPF is the God-centered global vision promoting non-violent action that builds a foundation for peace through strong, loving families and communities that live for the sake of others. On the right, that's the Imam Sadr Foundation, which is a Shia organization orphanage in the south of Lebanon. And on the left, that's a visit to a family. This is last year. I was happy to be able to attend with some of you in the room, the Peace Road in Derry. For me, this is a good example of learning. You know, I felt, nobody actually told me I was supposed to go there. I just felt, you have to go. I felt strongly pushed to be there. And we are here on a wall, the walls of Derry, where we went to have a prayer. And in the conference room later in the day, one of the people whose father had been killed on Bloody Sunday, if you know the reference, was a speaker. And he said, today you were on the walls, but I don't know how much you know about the walls. Those walls were built 400 years ago, 300 years ago, by Scottish people and English people in Ireland to keep Irish people out. And I was learning lessons by that time. I came away having learnt something that my people had done to other people that I never knew before. we learn these lessons everywhere around the world, and we have to put them right. In the Middle East, there are many such lessons. And on the right is the peace road that we did in Carlisle, which again, you can't see because it's so small, but right in the middle is the mayor of Carlisle. And she was obviously so delighted to meet a group like us. And where were we walking? Along Hadrian's Wall. Not to divide the Scots from the English, as the Romans might have wanted to do, but to show that from both sides of the world, of the wall, we want to cooperate together. So it was a good process. I want to combine two things with this slide. The first is a comment from UPF's chair, actually. He was talking to other staff people, and I think he probably didn't know that I was taking notes. But I liked what he said, because it's very simple but very true. UPF's methodology is really very simple. Be a good person, friendly, loving, engage people in dialogue, listen to them, learn from them. That's why all our reports are about convening people. Yeah. That's just true. Yeah. We are meeting people to understand, listen, learn from each other. And it's a process. On the right, there's two pictures from the same Syria conference I was talking about earlier. And this is the story of Thabet Abbara, who runs and owns a restaurant there in Cyprus. He invited the entire conference group to a Syrian dinner at his restaurant in Nicosia. When he first opened the restaurant 4 years before, he put a sign outside saying, "Nobody who supports the Assad regime is allowed to enter." He was pretty clear of where he stood. But that evening, 2 delegates from Syria, from the government, enjoyed a wonderful meal with us. It was very nice that we could do that. And this is somehow finding ways to go beyond the borders. This is a comment from a participant at the World Summit 2020 in Korea. This is the summit that gathered, I think it was 6,000 people, just as COVID was starting, and we had no cases. We were very careful, but actually everybody was in and out, and nobody was touched by COVID in the whole process. In the founding speech in 2005, Father Moon said, UPF should become an able-type counterpart to the existing United Nations. Able. You studied about Abel and Cain today. So somehow more connected to God than the existing one, to give a good example. And this is the comment of the advisor to the Vice President of Libya after the conference 15 years later. I have been to the UN General Assembly meeting in New York, European Union meetings in Brussels, African Union summit in Ethiopia, and countless conferences in so many countries around the world in my professional career as a nuclear engineer for decades and political advisor to President and Vice President of Libya during the last 7 years. But never have I seen a more organized event as this celebration in South Korea. What more can I say? I think he's saying that UPF is beginning to do what it should be doing. Earlier, Dr. David Earle shared the photo on the left and spoke about the one on the right. So I have both for you here. Character education programs that began in Russia, moved to China, are now moving in many other places. But this particular one is now in schools in Palestine. As I move into this section, I'm thinking of the part of UPF values or principles which says we are a spiritual being. And if we're a spiritual being, we have to think of the education of the character and the heart of the person, not just the professional education. So we have other programs. This one is currently being used in Sao Tome and in the Philippines and in different parts of the world. And it's developed according to the similar basic philosophy called 4 Family Loves, a curriculum for building good character and loving families. And it's done in combination with the Family Federation, Women's Federation, Youth and Students, as well as UPF. This is another program started originally through our World Association of NGOs, which was founded by Father Moon. He called it Play Football, Make Peace, and through that developed a program called Champions in Life, which teaches life values to football coaches, so that football coaches, when they coach children, can teach life values, so they become not just champions on the field, but champions in their life as well. And here are some of them demonstrating. There's a big program we did in Qatar recently. Also, of course, one of the main points of UPF was strengthening the family. And I've included a couple of slides here from past conferences. This one's a Family Day partnership with the United Nations Office of the Family. And these are a forum on marriage in Connecticut and a UN Day of Families event in Israel. And here again, I've taken one particular photograph, but I'm quoting again from the founding speech of Reverend Moon at the UPF. The value of the blessing as overcoming borders again, overcoming barriers. Imagine two enemy families who have cursed each other throughout their lives, people who would never dream of living together. What would happen if these families joined together through a cross-cultural holy marriage blessing? If a son from one family and a daughter from the other became husband and wife, loved each other and built a happy home, would the parents in these two families curse their own children? If that son loved his beautiful daughter of a hated enemy, and she as the daughter-in-law were to give birth to heaven's grandchildren as pure and clear as crystal, the grandparents would smile with pleasure. In time, the two lineages once soaked with enmity would be transformed. So this is using or understanding the potential of marriage as a peace-building institution on a massive way. I think probably some of you in the room are married to somebody from another culture. I know that's my case. My wife is from Japan. It can be challenging, but it can also be massively rewarding. I'm going to read, no, let's go on for the moment. Putting things right. This is Dr. Richard Kebedo, who I spoke about before. He's from Canada. And he decided he wanted to give an example of indemnity, which you heard about in one of the presentations earlier on. He said, as an evangelical Christian, let me give you an example of personal indemnity that you yourself can try out. And he was talking to a group of ministers, Christian ministers. If you have a bad relationship with a minister in your town, go home and invite him out to the best restaurant in town and tell him how sorry you are. You'd be surprised what can happen. I used to try to get evangelical ministers to have lunch with liberal ministers who they despised. You can imagine that, like a Sunni and a Shia saying, okay, let's do it. You know, in our different groupings, we have our different ways of boxing and categorizing each other. Oh, I'm not speaking to them. Actually, I know somebody who I was speaking to in a cafe yesterday here in London, whose husband's parents don't want to speak to her because she's Catholic, even though, and they're Protestant. You know, it still exists today, these kind of things. But he's showing ways to go beyond it. And that's what our life is about, finding ways to undo these blockages. So indemnity is based on sacrifice and service. And apologies to those of you who've heard this story from me 25 times already. I've been telling it for 40 years, but I cannot avoid the 1979 Birmingham experience. So here we go. Father Moon told the members of his church that it's a good idea to do home church and to go and serve people. And you should go and serve 360 families in the area. So people were faithfully doing that, and a young Japanese man was knocking on the doors in Birmingham, and he came to a particular door, which he knocked on. The door opened, the man looked at him and slammed the door in his face. So he thought, what should I do? He went away and bought a gift, and he came back the next day, and he knocked on the door, and then he stood like this with the gift. The man came to the door, opened it, was quite confused, and he said, I suppose you'd better come in. So they started to talk, and he began to visit him regularly, and he found out something. You see, this was 1979. In 1940, the Japanese had 1,600 prisoners of war in Singapore. They killed 1,596 of them. And this was one of the 4 that survived. So now you understand why he slammed the door, right? But they began to talk to each other, and they talked to each other. And one day, after about 3 months, the Englishman said to the Japanese man, I want to bring you to my church. So in the car on the way to the church, he said, you know, 40 years ago, when the British Army arrived, they liberated my body. In the last 3 months, you liberated my spirit. So now you understand why I can never stop telling that story. But the more I do so, the more I see that this is something that many people are doing. There are many wonderful examples. The Honourable Keith Best spoke in Ireland when we were together about the victim of the Brighton bombing meeting the people who had done it. And the story, which I think, Uniting for Peace, I read the article afterwards in their magazine. I read of what the victims in Colombia meeting the people who had committed atrocities. We hear of the Bereaved Family Forum, many different things where people are finding ways to go beyond this hatred and really rebuild something. So it's not one group that's good. It's one way of doing things that works. That's the point. It's a way of doing things that works. And if it works for us, it can work for you, it can work for anybody. Let's practice it more. Partnership involves, in this case, building integrity and trust. And here, that's the inauguration of the International Association of Parliamentarians for Peace in Morocco. And thanks to our good staff, who are not in the picture, Hermina Shallan worked very hard to develop relationship with the Arab International Parliamentary Union, who then agreed and understood what UPF was doing and sent out something to all the Arab nations and then promoted the whole event. And on the strength of that, there was a successful launch in the parliament, followed by another one in Morocco, which came exactly on the foundation of trust built in the Lebanon experience. If you, I have to tell you my own experience here, which was that I went with a member of the parliament to meet the Secretary General of the 2 houses of the Moroccan parliament, the 2 Secretaries General. And we discussed the plan. And I presented our plan, carefully discussed with the Member of Parliament from Morocco. At the end, after I described an international conference, we'll do this, and he looked at me and said, that's impossible. So my reaction was not very good. I said, you mean you can't get 12 people into your parliament who are members? Which is not the right thing to say, but I digested it after that, and I said, okay, if our plan doesn't work, what would your plan be? And then he presented what he'd like to do. And I said, well, let me speak to Dr. Walsh and see if we can do that. He looked at me and said, if you can do it, we will do it. We will not just do it, we will do it with joy. And there was a very great development, and I realized this is dialogue. You have to give space to the other. We always think we know the best way, but it's not true. We've been doing a series of Abraham Accords and Middle East Peace Initiative conferences over, webinars over the last year and a bit. And this was from the 11th one, the former Prime Minister Olmert. He made a comment which showed that we can move beyond the original agreement of the Abraham Accords from a year ago. And this is taken from the report in the Washington Times. Considering the fact that there is the Abraham Accords peace, the Palestinians must be top of the agenda. Now, this is an Israeli prime minister saying it, former one. But actually, they were deliberately excluded at the beginning. So this is a change of vision. We need to work together to forward rapidly, seriously, and responsibly, to work forward rapidly, seriously, and responsibly in order to create the kind of understanding which is a preliminary requirement for furthering the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians toward a full peace treaty. Now, of course, he's not in power, but it's very good that people can see movement and development there. This is a more recent encounter at Expo 2020, even though it happened in 2022. And we were meeting with ministers from both governments, and we're going to be developing a youth exchange program with the support of both governments. And these are one of the principles that we were hearing about of UPF. We are one human family created by one God. These are the words from the mid-1980s from the former Prime Minister of Egypt, Aziz Sidki, who was former chairman of the Council of Presidents in the 1980s Summit Council for Peace. And this is what he says: world peace will be achieved when we emphasize spiritual laws that transcend and give meaning to the physical world, and when we establish a world community of peaceful peoples and nations under the parenthood of God to build relations of true love among us all. I thought it's quite notable that somebody of his standing 40 years ago could be saying something like that. And then, what's Father Moon's own explanation of the greatest accomplishment of the International Conference on the Unity of the Sciences? There are 3 quotes here. One of them is Father Moon's own one. On the right, Dr. Robert Jastrow says, "The ecumenical spirit that pervades this conference is a revelation and a delightful surprise to me." These are scientists. But he said the ecumenical spirit, meaning people respect each other, learn from each other, understand each other. This is the UPF touch. Do you understand? It's not about what they're saying, it's about the way people are able to relate to each other, what spirit is created. And then Sun Myung Moon himself says, the greatest accomplishment of ICUS is that we have established a close and warm family bond. That's the greatest, he said. I would have thought he'd say, you know, we've discovered how to deal with this environmental problem or something like that. But actually, it's the quality of our relationships that is the most important. I've never met a man, Dr. Kenneth Mellenby from the UK, who combined such a sense of humor with deadly seriousness about the major problems of the world. And on the left, that's a book of the proceedings. Well, I guess you probably think these 2 politicians don't usually talk to each other or share the same place. But at World Summit 22, they were both there and both participating enthusiastically and indeed speaking well of each other, which nobody could have predicted. Exactly. And we would say that's because there's that one parent that's bringing us together. And I love this picture because it tells me something simple. That's like a family snap, isn't it? Yeah. But who's the guy at the front on his knee? President of Paraguay. Doesn't he look just like your brother? That's right. It's a family. That's the point. The family spirit is there. And that's why I put home is where your heart is. So here we go. Go forward. Remember this. With the heart of a parent and the shoes of a servant, shedding sweat for earth, tears for man, and blood for heaven. So here are some shoes for you of a servant. God bless you. Thank you.